Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. And today my guest is Galen Kranz, who is a professor of architecture, sociologist, designer, author, lecturer, and certified teacher of the Alexander Technique. She's probably best known in the Alexander world for a book she wrote about 14 years ago called The Chair, Rethinking Culture, Body, and Design. I would say must reading for anyone who's at all concerned about sitting. We're going to talk today about something that is more related specifically to the Alexander technique, which is one of the sort of self-help directions that Alexander teachers will often teach their students is something along the lines of I'm letting my neck be free in order that my head can move forward and up, or in some versions can release away from my torso, or something along those lines. But the word my head tends to appear in Alexander self directions, and we're going to talk a little bit about just what that head is. Galen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Could
I'm
you, yeah?
I'm glad to be able to talk about this with somebody else who cares about this subject.
Well, Alexander teachers care a lot about their heads and their necks, hopefully. Could you? But for those, I think maybe this interview will be more interest to Alexander teachers than the general public. But I wonder if you could just give a very short definition of the Alexander technique for anyone who's not familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. I call it a system of posture and movement. And if somebody pauses and looks at me expectantly like they want more, then I'll say it was invented 100 years ago by an Australian, and it's used by people in the performing arts to learn to move more expressively and articulately. And it's also used by people in pain in order to get rid of pain, but it is neither therapy nor performance. It is a form of kinesthetic education.
Right, and Alexander teachers are our teachers. We're not therapists.
Exactly.
So as I said before, Alexander teachers are very interested in their heads and how their heads relate to the rest of their bodies, and they're very interested in their students' heads and how their students' heads are related to the rest of their bodies. And we had a little brief conversation before the interview in which you and I discovered we had something in common, which is that we have both thought about what this head is that everyone's talking about, and it may not be quite as simple as many teachers or Alexander students think about it as. Do you want to start by saying a little bit about some of your refinements on the word head?
Okay. Well, I noticed that most of the English teachers would just say, let your head go forward and up, dear. And I guess I thought I knew what my head was, more or less. So I imagined that there was a kind of my head was sort of hovering on my neck, like a little hovercraft relationship between the occiput and the top vertebrae of the spine. Sort of imagined a little kind of airy space, a hovercraft, some little force creating an interesting flotation or tension there. Flotation, you might say. That's about as much as I thought about it. And then I got introduced to ideas from cranial osteopathy about the fact that the bones in the head move.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the British are keen on this. The British osteopaths recognize this as a simple fact, and apparently, I've heard that American ones are not so certain. But um, generally, I think it's the cranial osteopaths are all convinced that those bones move, and they move on the kind of float you can float them apart on the dura. That's how they do treat them therapeutically. But for us, the idea is simply that they move. And so I began to think of taking the occiput back and up and letting the frontal bone, the forehead bone, release forward and up. And if we allow this opposition between the two bones, bingo, uprightness gets created as a byproduct. So we don't have to seek or to go up. We simply let the occiput, the bottom bone of the skull, drift back and up as we let the frontal bone go forward and up. Now, the idea from craniosacral osteopathy is that there's something called flexion and extension in these cranial bones. That is, the frontal bone and the occiput drift apart, and the parietals, the side bones, come together, and then the parietals widen, and the frontal bone and the occiput come together. So there's this very slow moving flexion and extension in the cranium itself. And the purpose of it is, one of its purposes is to be able to pump cerebral spinal fluid. And you need a free sacrum for that, for the other end of that whole system. Cerebral spinal fluid doesn't have a heart to pump it, so it has to rely on the movement of flexion and extension in the cranium and the sacrum. So I was happy with that for quite some time, and would demonstrate to people. If you imagine you've got a piece of cloth in your hands right now, and one hand is the occiput, and the other hand is the frontal bone, and you just take those two ends apart very gently. What happens to the middle? The middle comes up. It's just simple physics. Mm-hmm. And I got really good results. I could feel people coming up all the way from the soles of their feet just by letting these two bones drift apart. And I could get this in a first lesson. So I was pretty happy with myself, patting myself on the back. And then this idea got even further refined when I met Peter Grunwald and started working with his work on how to use the brain. In his case, it was to see without using glasses. And he has picked out a particular spot in the brain at the top of the visual cortex, which he calls the upper visual cortex, and wants one to direct from there and let the front of the brain do its own thing. Mm-hmm. So I began to see that head might have, there was even a much more internal understanding of what head is, that the brain stem itself releases forward and up, and the coordinating lobe, which sometimes I've seen in some books called the associative cortex, that it stays back and up, and we don't fall forward into our frontal lobes. So, my understanding of what head is undergone a lot of transformation.
And I think that certainly when I was training in England back in the late 70s and early 80s, I don't remember anyone ever saying anything other than the head as though it were a kind of a solid unit that was, as you say, poised at the top of your spine, and how you manage that relationship between this pretty solid unit and your spine was very important. But there wasn't much of an idea of any internal movements within the head. I too discovered craniosacral work, not the American osteopathic version, I guess you might say. And I think that anyone who spends any time having cranial work very quickly knows that there's movement, because you can directly sense it, and you can sense it on other people as well. So it's certainly, that kind of blows away the idea of the head as a fixed, like a bowling ball kind of thing. But I also started thinking about other aspects of the head. Maybe you've been thinking about those as well. Certainly, the most obvious one is the jaw, which maybe technically is not part of the head. I don't know how anatomists deal with that, but when most Alexander teachers are thinking of the head moving forward and up, or whatever they're thinking of, they're usually assuming that the jaw is kind of part of that. And yet, of course, the jaw's got its own little world of independence there with respect to the rest of the head, which I think Alexander was definitely aware of that. I think whispered ah and is his exercise is dealing with that. And the other thing that kind of sprung into my mind early on was the eyes, which clearly move around independently. And certainly when you work with a student and help them with a little change in how their head's managed on top of their spine, typically they got to rearrange the way their eyes are managed relative to their head. So there's obviously a lot more going on than a solid unit. And I think that has huge implications for Alexander teachers and students.
I think so too. And I think it's a disservice to continue with the solid unit. Just to let your head go forward, not much deal.
Yes.
I think we need to incorporate the newer stuff that we now know. I mean, okay, they didn't know, but now we do know about.
Right.
So, and now we know a lot about the brain and the eyes and the jaw, and so there's no reason not to accommodate that knowledge into our work, even if it means adjusting our paradigm a wee bit.
Yeah, I agree, and it's funny because I had a conversation with Peter Grunwald for a podcast a few weeks ago, in which, of course, his one of his big interests is the brain. Mm-hmm. Now, when Alexander was doing his investigations, he totally got that mind and body were two aspects of the same thing, but back in those days, the brain itself was not all that well understood, certainly not very well mapped in the way it is today.
Yes.
And I found, for example, kind of following up on something that Peter said, and I've just been playing around with it, and this is not his exact phrasing by any means, but and I tend to go for negative directions. I am not statements. So if I say I'm not compressing my brain or not squeezing my brain or something along those lines, it has tremendously useful effects. And especially if I have some idea of where my brain is. So I just get an anatomy book out and take a look and see where the various parts of my brain are located.
Well, I must say my first teacher, Tom Lemons, not my first teacher, but my trainer, would say when I couldn't get something, I'd say, I don't know how to do it. And he'd say, you have to find the place in your brain that isn't letting go and let go. Mm-hmm. So I did have that very simple idea, find the place in your brain, but I didn't know any anatomy either. So mm-hmm. Now I know a lot more, and I've gotten interested in the three basic layers of the brain, the reptilian, the mammalian, and the neocortex. Mm-hmm. I've gotten interested in how you can consciously move into one or the other of those, and how you can actually grow a part of your brain. I mean, if you start to imagine something that you can't see, mm-hmm. it actually makes the visual cortex enlarge. Like you can put your hand about on your colic, mm-hmm. and if you imagine, start to describe something that you can't see, but you want to detail it, oh, this house or these flowers or what your dog looks like or someplace you've been. That part of the brain, you can activate that part of the brain and you can feel it, swell up a bit, not in the negative sense of a swelling, but I mean, like a cauliflower or something, grow, expand a bit. So it's almost like you can lift yourself back and up by imagining, using the brain in that way, which is a principle from body mind centering, that the contents shape the container. So now the ultimate content is the brain tissue itself. I mean, lungs can shape the rib cage, etc. It's a kind of a radical idea that the contents can shape the container.
Right,
And
but I think for the brain especially, I think most people have an idea of the brain being this kind of like a computer thing that it does its stuff up there, and we're we're not the idea of affecting its size or shape in a useful way just doesn't really occur to most people. I think maybe an image might be like a hard drive on a computer. It just
yeah,
is. All
yeah,
the stuff is there. Why would you want to slightly expand it or something like that? You can't do it with a hard drive, but with your brain you can.
you can. It's a self-regulating gizmo, or set universe. It's not even a gizmo.
Right.
And we know from people who quit thinking that their brain shrinks to the size of a walnut.
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
those horrible cases of people kept alive for years in a coma. When they do autopsies, they find the thing has gotten really tiny because it's never been used. So it's the use of the brain enlarges various parts of it, depending on how you use it. If you use it, for math, if you use it for art, you'll get different parts of the brain developed more than other parts.
Hmm.
So you can use your brain to use Alexander lingo.
Yeah, and I would guess that if F. Matthias Alexander were to resurface today and take a look at CAT scans and MRIs, he'd be fascinated by that.
He would, because he loved science and he wanted to ally himself with science.
And but he would see the implications for his more general
He
ideas that if you I think to summarize kind of what he came upon was that we can control the way we function by the way we think. And he would see this as a very useful avenue for self-direction.
he would. I'm with you. I think he would. Maybe he's applauding us now. Who knows? Da, da, da.
I like to think so. I like to think he's here in spirit anyway. Galen, is there anything else you'd like to say on this topic of heads and?
Well, yeah. One fun factoid
Okay, yeah.
that I learned from studying with Bonnie Cohen, in body mind centering.
Hmm.
She says that embryologically, the occiput was once upon a time going to be a vertebrae,
Oh,
and
that's
it,
interesting.
and so it converts to becoming the bottom bone of the skull. And for me, that's a really wonderful idea, because it suggests that yes, indeed, the occiput does stay back and up as part of spine,
Hmm.
and the rest of the skull is what flexes forward and up. So there's actually what McDonald would call opposition in the skeletal structure of the head itself.
Oh, that's interesting, and maybe a couple of other examples of teachers who have done some exploring in this area of the head being a little different than maybe most Alexander teachers think of it. Certainly, Missy Vinyard in her book talks about the frontal cortex as being a really good place to put your mental attention, particularly if you're trying to solve problems and so on. The actual physical location of it is useful to know about. And from another strand of the Alexander technique, I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of John Appleton, posture release imagery. Are you familiar with that at all?
No.
He's a teacher not too far from me. He's in Springfield, Missouri. He
Posture release, did you say?
posture release imagery. I'll put a link to it by this interview.
Yeah.
His one of his interests is in dorsal ventral structure of our bodies. In that, and he looks at that and uses that as an avenue for bringing about changes. And he's got the whole body, including the head, mapped in
Mm.
terms of what parts dorsal and what parts ventral, and they which is something I had never thought about until coming across his work. And it he uses a kind of an imagery that is based on the reality of the structure, but again, he's not just interested in the head, he's interested in the whole body. But even within the head there are dorsal ventral separations there and borders between them. So those are a couple of other examples that I know of where teachers have gone beyond the head. Well, I guess we could call it the head as bowling ball image.
Yes.
And I guess the main purpose of our conversation here is to kind of get those ideas out there for people to explore. I mean, Alexander himself said very clearly, I don't have his exact words, but he said, I just hope that what I've done is a nice points to points the way for other investigators
Well,
who are going to take my approach to things, but learn a lot more as they experiment with it. And he didn't say this, but obviously, as science brings us new information about ourselves. So,
right. I think that's what we're doing
and
here.
that's what we're doing here. We're right at the cutting edge of head mapping, you might
Yeah.
say. Well, Galen, unless you have anything else you want to say, this might be a good place to bring this to an end. What do you think?
I
Unless
could.
there's something else you're desperate to say.
No, I'm not desperate to say
Oh,
anything else.
okay. So,
Except maybe you and
yeah,
I should do a workshop at a Alexander conference on the
on the
head.
head. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's I'm open to that.
I can
Um,
come this year.
let's arrange that. My guest today has been Galen Kranz, who's in addition to being a professor of architecture at UC Berkeley and many other things in the academic world, has been an Alexander teacher for over 20 years. And we will put she's written a book called The Chair: Rethinking Culture, Body, and Design, which I highly recommend anyone who's interested in Alexander type ideas to read. And Galen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.